Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. Our dedication to living life joyfully allows us to confront the reality of unmitigated deception and political denial of the harm caused by nuclear and chemical contamination. We demand an end to corporate control of science and suppression of facts for political and financial gain. We are not assets on a balance sheet. We must honestly work together to remediate damage to benefit our planet and humanity. Remember, happiness is resistance, and love is greater than fear. Join the Age of Fission radio show on Spreaker.com. Search for Lonnie Clark for all our podcasted shows. Podcasts are also on YouTube at Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART. Thank you for being part of the solution. Good evening. This is your host, Lonnie Clark, with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us, whether you're listening to us on the internet at www.kepw.org at 11 p.m. at night on Thursday nights, or on KEPW, which is 97.3 FM LP here in Eugene and Springfield. And that's also at 11 p.m. on Thursday nights. Or if you're catching our podcast at any hour of the day on my Spreaker channel, that's Spreaker, Spreaker.com. It's a podcasting hosting site, essentially. And you can look for Lonnie Clark. I host my show, The Age of Fission, Nuclear Hot Seat, Operation Save the Earth, and very soon a new show called The Last Nuke. And I've been playing them up on my own, putting the podcasts up on my Age of Fission radio show. There you go. So tonight I want to start out our show with a little bit of poetry, because I like reading poetry and I think it really helps our brains think. I found my favorite poet, Lao Tzu, from The Way of Life, Witter Bynner, and that is probably the one book of poetry that I will quote most from. So I am reading number 71. A man who knows how little he knows is well. A man who knows how much he knows is sick. If, when you see the symptoms, you can tell, your cure is quick. A sound man knows that sickness makes him sick, and before he catches it, his cure is quick. I think that really speaks well for where we are right now. We have to be a little bit of humble. The news this week is actually grim. You know, over the last couple of weeks, I have been reporting, let's take stock of it. First it was for sure the Trump administration reclassified 100 million gallons of the most toxic radioactive waste at the Hanford sites as low-level radioactive waste. And not just the Hanford, it's also at the Idaho National Lab. I think it's something like 60,000 gallons. The bulk of it, though, is at Hanford. And then we have the Idaho National Lab, the Savannah site in South Carolina, and then all the other so-called legacy sites, the Manhattan Project sites. They're all now called legacy sites. And they are all over the place. So he's going to call that high-level radioactive waste low-level. Then the following week, what did I report on next? I reported on the fact that he has prevented the Nuclear Defense Oversight, Nuclear Defense Safety Oversight Board from going on to these, quote, legacy sites. The Nuclear Safety Defense Board was created because this was a project of the government, right? So when they realized they had all this waste, they created this oversight board as a kind of a second layer of safety, and these scientists get to go onto the legacy sites and they talk with the employees. They figure out, okay, they put their heads together on how we can move this waste or how we could do that. They were instrumental in letting us know that the waste isolation processing plant, I think that's the name of it, in Carlsbad, New Mexico on February 14th, 2014, actually collapsed. The NRC, the Department of Energy was not about to tell us. And the oversight board that goes on to these legacy sites figured it out and made it public. So it is a very important oversight board. I've been sort of jumping up and down. I called Ron Wyden's office. I have called Pete DeFazio's office. I actually spoke to the Department of Transportation overall, the committee on the Department of Transportation, because Pete DeFazio sits on that board, and I sent them some information so they can dig into it themselves. We have to be the watchdogs here. And so then what do we get? Then the last week I read this report from the Hanford nuclear site that says, these buildings, these big gigantic annex buildings are falling apart. And we can't wait to 2032 until the next CERCLA hearing comes up and, the decision from CERCLA says, okay, we're going to do it. CERCLA is, again, kind of a regulatory oversight agency that determines what should be done up there. And so this report was basically saying it's time for us to change that. So, okay, so all of that's really bad, right? As if it can't get more shocking. It honestly does feel like an assault. This week, the news came out that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, has been urged by the Trump administration to cut back its budget. He's really intent on cutting back the budget on everything so that he can show bigger profits. This is how the economy is growing, on the backs of chemical and nuclear contamination. Because when companies don't have to pay money to create safety, they have more profits. So his economy is just based on destroying our country. But this week, the NRC was encouraged to cut back its budget by reducing oversight at nuclear power plants, private nuclear power plants that supply energy to me and you. These incompetents, I will call them incompetents. They're illiterate and they're incompetent. They have no idea what they're doing. I have been spitting nails over this, to be honest, and contacting our elected officials and engaging them quite a bit. And not just my own senators. I called up the entire caucus in Oregon, and I called Kate Brown's office. I think this is an outrage. While the Democrats are playing nicey-nicey and wanting to follow the Constitution and being to the letter of the law, and we want to make sure we have proof before we impeach this president and blah, they have proof. They have proof. They could hold impeachment hearings today if they wanted to. Nancy Pelosi does not want to. She would rather allow the criminal in the White House to stay there so that she can play this, we're going to have the worst president in the world so the Democrats will win and we'll just fear vote for them, while they are upending 80 years of nuclear safety. I have been sounding the alarm. We cannot wait for the Democrats to decide. This is urgent. We have got to put the force on. This administration must be stopped. They are a danger to the planet. That's how I feel about it, honestly. This is why I call. I literally have a file on my desk before I start work every day. I get into my office around 9:30, and I call my elected officials first thing in the morning every day. And I asked Pete DeFazio's office, have you changed your mind about supporting impeachment? Today, the vote came down that nope, he's not for impeachment because it's a nuanced deal and they want to win the election, while they're allowing the Trump administration to upend all of our nuclear safety and chemical contamination. This actually, you want to hear a little anecdote? This is really interesting. One of the first safety regulations that the Trump administration overturned, and it wasn't really a safety regulation, it was a medicine that had been, the pharmaceuticals wanted to have it out on the market because it's really highly profitable. And the Food and Drug Administration repeatedly, like thousands of times, tested this drug because of the lobbyists kept pressuring every administration. They've been wanting to produce it for about 8 or 9 years. But it regularly showed serious harm to young women. I mean, anybody who takes this medicine, I forgot the name of it, I apologize. But anybody who took it got very sick, like within 5 years. And it caused them very serious problems with their blood, with their internal organs, with their female parts. The first drug that the Trump administration allowed on the market was this one. Without any additional testing, they just said, yeah, we're good to go. And that has been his attitude since the get-go. Now we've got this full-on assault to the American people with the nuclear industry. And I don't know about you guys, but it's why I do this podcast. It is the reason I have reached out. I mean, this is one of the things I have realized in my short life as a so-called activist. And I don't call myself an activist. I call, Ron Wyden's office said, well, it's really, people like you, the activists out there, the whistleblowers, they do make a difference. I'm like, I'm not a whistleblower and I'm not really an activist. I consider this my American duty. This is my duty to my children, to my country, to my future, to the place we live, to Gaia, our planet, our everything here. We're just going to silently sit by while the administrations, honestly, we can't just blame Trump because it's not just Trump. The nuclear industry is like one of the most strongest lobbying, it's one of the biggest industries in the world. And it is got a grip hold around the throat of every government on this planet. I do not know why we have this, but it is the real reality. I mean, they will lie. Look what happened in Chernobyl. I mean, every nuclear facility is based on lying. I mean, that is the bottom line truth. At Chernobyl, they lied to people about what was going on. Every one of those people that went outside to look at the fire, they all died. The children in Chernobyl, they're still being born with polydactyls, means they have like 6, 5, 6, 7, not 5 fingers, like 5 fingers and a thumb, or 6 fingers and a thumb, or 4 fingers and 2 thumbs, or some kind of weird anomaly like that. It's not like it changes them a whole lot, but they got like these weird growth things, right? Or then they grow up and have autoimmune diseases. I mean, John Goffman in his book, Poison Power, which I read on my YouTube channel, Nuts for Art, which you guys can, if you want to see my work that's outside of this radio show, you can go to my YouTube channel. I will warn you, I rant sometimes and I go off because I want people to get excited. I want people to go, wow, this is affecting me. And it is affecting you. That's the reality. And I can't tell you what to do. I can just tell you what I'm doing. You get to pick what you're going to do for yourselves and your family. For me, I choose to poke them in the eye. I get it. The nuclear industry is a big, strong industry. One of the things Louisa and I discovered when we were doing the last nuke show, we were doing some research on what the heck is Mox Field. We wanted to know what that was for sure. But one of the things that we saw on the website of a pro-nuclear, it was like some government agency, was that they make all the worldwide nuclear power plants around the world makes 70,000 tons of plutonium every year. So there's a reason why they want the nuclear industry. Like today the news came up, and I was going to read the article, but I think it's kind of boring to just read the article. There was a article about what is going on in Ohio. Ohio's legislature just passed a law that says they're going to basically subsidize some old nuclear power facilities that should be closing down. They're like 40 years old, and they're going to renew the license. I mean, consider this. Every nuclear power facility was only made to be in operation for 20 years. That was most of them. They started it. And then a few years ago, they said, oh, no, 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 no. After Fukushima, we can let them go to 40 years. So now they're going for 40 years. And what they really want to do is extend the life to 80 years. So in Ohio, they passed a law that said they did that. But what's going to happen is just having that alone. Can you imagine if, they extend the lives of these wobbly old nuclear power facilities at the same time Trader Trump has limited the access of the oversight boards of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? I can't be quiet about that. That's why I'm here doing this podcast, to be honest. It is a shock beyond shock. So I'm going to go to this. Look, I'm going to go find those articles because here it is. This is the one that says about fewer inspections. Hold on. This article is in the New York Times, and it actually came out today, July 17th. That's when I'm recording this. Fewer inspections for aging nuclear power plants. Regulators propose. The New York Times, written by Carol Davenport. A new report by staff members of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which oversees the safety of the nation's 59 aging nuclear power plants, recommends that the commissioner significantly weaken or reduce the safety inspections of the plants. The report, published this Tuesday, comes after a year-long consultation and public meeting process, including views from the Nuclear Energy Institute, which lobbies on behalf of the nuclear power plant industry and has long sought weaker safety regulations. It also comes amid a broad push by the Trump administration for reduced regulations in the industry. And of course, the Congress is balking at this. They could stop it. I mean, it's not like they don't have a choice. They oversee it. I mean, it is beyond comprehension. Right now, there's only 4 commissioners on the 5-member panel. So, because Trump hasn't nominated anybody, because Trump is undermining our government. He hasn't nominated a lot of his cabinet in a lot of places. There's hundreds of jobs open in the government. This is a gigantic government, and it needs to be filled with professionals. But the person who is attempting to overthrow our government is just leaving these things to wither and die. This is really disgusting. This is beyond comprehension that this has gone on. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but for me, this isn't just a small issue. At a time when they're moving nuclear waste across the country, that's high-level radioactive waste, they limit the access of that safety board. And now at these failing nuclear power facilities, the old aged nuclear power facilities, they're recommending less oversight. I mean, I don't know about you. This is where I start getting like all conspiracy theorists about they're really attempting to do serious harm to our planet. And for what reason? When I first started this radio show, it's kind of interesting. A man that worked in South Africa contacted me. He was a New Yorker. He was an expat, and he was living there and working there, and then he was coming back and forth. He literally, he believed that there were people that there were like aliens. This is where the conspiracy theories really go. It's like there's aliens out there that want us to have all this plutonium. You want to know what I think? The aliens actually are psychotic nuclear war proponents because when you can connect the dots, these nuclear power facilities make 70 tons of plutonium every year. What do they use plutonium for? To make nuclear weapons. That's really what they're using it for. They have every intention of just building and building more nuclear weapons and going out in space and blowing things up. I read here on this radio show recently when I picked up the mantle of redoing my radio show. I basically had given up on it because I was very disheartened that Americans weren't concerned about the damage to their health, to their children. I mean, even though I had quite a bit of listeners on the other, on UCY.TV. When it ended, I think we were getting listened to fairly regularly to about 20,000 people. That's what they were telling me anyways. And I could have picked it up and gone hard steam on some podcasting thing, and I just was heartbroken that Americans don't care enough to take to the street to demand their elected officials. But I do have to thank Libby Halevi with Nuclear Hot Seat, a show that I hope all of you listen to, because it is, I mean, honestly, her shows, I listen to them twice a week. I edit them here for KEPW.org, for www.kepw.org, 97.3 FM LP here in Eugene, Oregon, because it is a 5013C channel, and I have to take out her little clips asking, for assistance. So that has to come out for her show to be on the air here. So I do that because I want people in our area to hear her shows. I mean, they are valuable. She plays at 7:30 in the morning on Saturdays on KEPW. Or you could go to her website at www.nuclearhotseat.com. I encourage all of my listeners actually to seek out organizations to find out information, especially from your neck of the woods. There's a lot of people here in the Northwest that aren't from here, your families in other parts of the country, because I guarantee you there are problems everywhere. So I had stopped doing this because I was kind of heartbroken, but really, honestly, I came back because of Jana Thrift, the manager of this radio station at KEPW. She was like, Lonnie, you got to pick it back up, because really there's very few people doing it. Libby Halevi has the longest running anti-nuke show out there. Carl Grossman has just figured out how to do, I think it's called Enviro News. I put out a message to him because I'd like to be able to turn his video podcast that he puts out on YouTube now as MP3s and play them on my show. So there's just very few people talking about all this stuff. And it's right underneath our noses. For example, this has been, the thing that I've been spitting nails about all week long. It's incomprehensible that the Trump administration is upending 80 years of the little bit of nuclear regulatory safety we had between the military and the private industry. He's like limited access. He wants to limit access. It's incomprehensible. I mean, what is incomprehensible to me is that the Democrats continue to just let it go. Yeah, and I can hear all those political junkies kind of chiding me and going, yeah, well, what do you expect out of them? They're horrible anyways. I completely agree. Today I talked to June Chada over at Ron Wyden's local office, because I called up to verbosely object to him not demanding impeachment. And she talked to me for quite a while, because one of the things that it's her job to make me believe that Ron Wyden really cares about me. And boy, should she get a raise, because she did a good job this morning. She talked to me for over an hour. And she essentially, honestly, basically said that Ron Wyden has said in public hearings that he's for it, but there's, he doesn't want to overstep his place by criticizing the Speaker of the House, and they're all sort of tiptoeing on protocol because they don't want to be like the buffoon Trump and blah, blah, But you know what? When I said to her, all that's really great, except that we're leaving in power a person who is upending 80 years of nuclear safety. Even though I believe that the, quote, nuclear safety we have is a bunch of liars, and they underestimate the harm they're causing to our environments as a matter of policy, at least we had it. Now we're not going to have anything. These licensees are just going to be dumping bigly into our rivers, allowing nuclear waste to go into our water supplies, which you cannot just scratch your fingers and take it out immediately. Go ask the people of Fukushima about that. It's incomprehensible, beyond incomprehensible. So anyways, I have leaned into this radio show once again, thanks to Jana Thrift. And I am setting up an interview with Dawn Chapman from the St. Louis Just Moms group. She's kind of the leader. You guys may have seen her on TV because St. Louis has a burning nuclear fuel site. And she's telling me that they have had some breaches because of the flooding there. And they're having a community meeting next week. So I'm going to interview her this Friday, and I'll play her interview next week. I have reached out to Carl Grossman, and I believe we'll be getting an interview with him. And then we have Diane Turco, who I credit 100% for getting me back on board to doing these podcasts with vigor, because she worked on the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, closing it it's in Massachusetts. It's on the opposite end of the country, but the power plant is identical to the one at the Columbia Generating Station. It took her 32 years of working to get that nuclear power plant closed down. However, her success could help us close our dangerous nuclear power facility, Columbia Generating Station, with much more speed and gravity because they are identical nuclear facilities, or as close as they come. It's the same mark, because every nuclear facility, they're not one of them are cookie cutter, but they're the same type. She actually got a court judgment. This is why they closed down Pilgrim. The court decided that this power plant is a danger to the community based on X, Y, and Z. And all of that X, Y, and Z we have at the Columbia Generating Station. So I'm super excited not only to interview her to discuss like the process of being involved in some activity for 32 years. That's raising an adult child. It's an incomprehensibly long period of time to stick with it, but it's kind of like me. I'm not going to be giving up until we shut these things down. In fact, every single nuclear power facility ought to be shut down. And that comes from the words of Arnie Gunderson, who was he's an ex-nuclear power guy. He worked in these facilities and he was very pro-nuclear all of his life. And when Fukushima happened, he even still was kind of pro-nuclear. He wasn't it took him several years to give up his dodgy thinking, to be honest. And now he is actually quite anti-nuclear. He has very strong opinions about it, but in the meantime, he made his living and he was one of the nuclear liars. So I don't know. There's a lot of people that are very angry at him because you can't spend your life being a monster and then go, oops, sorry, I've seen the errors of my ways and I'm going to be advocating for sanity now, and then be considered an expert. So I don't know. I do respect him as an expert. I heard Arnie Gunderson talking about these EMPs. We're having electromagnetic pulses from the sun, and these flares, I guess that's what they are. We get these big sun flares, and they're hitting our Earth at big impacts. And when they hit our Earth, if one hits the United States and breaks down our electrical power grids, our nuclear facilities are not set up to last on generators for weeks on end, which is what it would take to repair the grid, the electrical grid. And he said we would have a catastrophe that is untold on the planet because of the broken down nuclear facilities. So this has been the short-sightedness of the politicians in D.C. I mean, when Newt Gingrich said he wanted to strangle the baby or drown the baby in the bathwater, I guess strangling it's the same. Yeah. Drowning the baby in the bathwater. And they continue to just cut back and cheat. Like right now, Trader Trump wants to cut back on these. If we had an accident at a nuclear power facility, heaven help us. You know what the people who passed those regulations would say? Oh, we had no idea this would ever happen. How did we know? I mean, this is the thing. I had a protest sign that I've used quite a bit, and I actually have two of them. One of them says, release science from corporate control. because that's what we need to do. We need scientists to be scientists again, instead of giving the corporations that pay them a paycheck the answer they want to hear. That's why John Goffman got kicked out of the nuclear industry. Him and Arthur Tamplin and Linus Pauling, they were like drummed out when they refused to tell the government that, yeah, the nuclear waste isn't so bad and we could put it in our dishes and in our plates. They're like, heck no. And in fact, let me just tell you that there was a period of time after World War II where they did put new radioactive waste into plates and dishes and silverware. So when you go into a thrift store, you got to think about it. Put your Geiger counter to some of these things. That's what I do. So we're kind of in a pickle here, folks. Like where we've allowed ourselves to go with this nuclear industry. You know, there are so many people working on this. This is the thing. It's like there's all these different groups, like the groups in St. Louis, but you know, they have their issues there. And frankly, in St. Louis, it's part of that legacy site that I told you about that has actually, St. Louis is in particular an unusual area. I think I talked to you about it before. There was a documentary called The First Secret City. And in that documentary, they talk about the 4 sites that are actually, their issues are completely different. The diseases all are the same. The ailments are all the same. The death is the same. In some places it's higher, some places it's lower. And that has to do with economics, honestly, and race. But there's these 4 sites like surrounding St. Louis. The Bridgeton site, which was where 200,000 tons of uranium was buried, and then it was buried and nobody told anybody, and then they built this super posh, like super sweet little neighborhood, and people lived there for years and years and years. The kids played in the creeks, and they thought they lived on the most perfect place on the planet. And then when they started realizing, like, hey, we're all sick, we all have these same kinds of diseases, they started plotting it. That's how we discovered this problem in St. Louis. So even in St. Louis, these 4 sites were isolated, and they didn't really know about each other for quite a long time. So, you know, that's why they call it the First Secret City. So then Larry Bergen, who you've heard me talk about, he's across the river, across from St. Louis. He's actually from Illinois. And I think, what's the name of his little city? It was Athens, I think, or something like that. Anyways, he worked in a uranium processing plant that they didn't tell him he was working in a uranium processing plant. He thought he was in fact smelting metal all of his life, and I think he said it was aluminum. And one day, people came in with big masks and face masks and everything, and total white suit for nuclear contamination. It was the government coming in to clean up the old machinery that he happened to be working on, that had been literally dripping with uranium. As it turns out, when he was working overtime, they did do some type of uranium processing. He wasn't told that it was that. And they never cleaned off the machinery in between. So Larry's at the end of his lawsuit, so I'm hoping we can get him back on air. I did interview him when I was with UCY.tv. His attorney advised him to stop talking publicly because he's about to get a boatload of money and they don't want to kill their case. So he has not been able to come back on the air with me, and he's trying to figure out what he can do, what he can talk about when he comes back. So we're negotiating. We're talking about that. So then we have that. We have the Bridgeton area. We have the place in Athens, Illinois. I believe that's it. And then we have the Weldon Springs area where they piled up for years and years and years just uranium waste, used the uranium, the spent, the byproduct of after they process it. The company out there which was processing the uranium for the government, Mallinckrodt, they basically had this byproduct, and so they were dumping it in Weldon Springs and making this huge, gigantic mountain out of uranium waste byproduct, and it turns into these little black pebbles, and it looks like black dirt. The people there describe it as black dirt, and the kids grew up, played on it, put cardboard on it and, ran down the hill. For them, they thought it was fine. Nobody knew that it was contamination. And then kids started getting really sick, and we're talking like 15, 20 years later. It wasn't until people grew up kids had illnesses, but doctors never related that site to their illnesses. So then when they did 20, 30 years later discover that this site was contaminated, you know what they did with it? This is incomprehensible. They covered it up with concrete, put a bike path on top of it, and it's called Legacy Park at Weldon Springs. Literally, they have children going for school outings up there. It's incomprehensible. I mean, they're just sitting on top of radioactive waste. So that's the Weldon Springs site. And I do know somebody from Weldon Springs who did interview with me on UCY.tv, Wendy Lametta. She's a beautiful soul. Super smart. This was like one of the smartest women I've talked to. Like, honestly, I could not tell you how much I admire her. She was sick as a child, discovered after spending lots of money that she was sterile. And the reason she stopped interviewing with me was she got brain cancer. Brain tumor, and she had to have this serious operation. It just kind of took a lot out of her, so she stopped interviewing. But she lived in Weldon Springs. Her family grew up there, so that's the kind of thing that happens. And then there's the Westlake landfill where the Just Moms of St. Louis are from, and the Westlake landfill is a dirty little story because Mallinckrodt, who was processing the plants and managing it all, when it all closed down, they sold it to another company called Republic Services. And the government for like 18 years was removing, when they discovered long ago about these 200,000 tons. They were rail cars basically buried right near Coldwater Creek. So as they were taking it out, somewhere along there in 1973, that company illegally sold something like 50,000 tons of uranium waste to Republic Services, who buried it in a landfill next to the Westlake landfill. It's called the Westlake landfill. And unbeknownst to the residents around there, this nuclear waste was buried, but also in that site, because it's a Brownsfield site, it's a fuse wrap site, formerly utilized remediation site. That's what fuse wrap means. And that's a place where they put super toxic waste, like from making airplanes and all kinds of horrible things. They put it in these fuse wrap sites and they chemically keep them separated. But what they actually did was they had all of this waste before it became a fuse wrap site, before they really discovered they had something horrible on their hands. There was all this waste from Bechtel and from other manufacturers down there, military manufacturers. Well, then they put the nuclear contamination in there. And somewhere along the line, because all of this wasn't handled, they didn't follow their own good, safe practices. It created an underground fire, which isn't called a fire. They call it a smoldering event. But what happened was the thing blew up and there was like smoke coming out of the landfill for like years and years, like 5 years, folks. You wouldn't believe it, but it's true. So the Westlake moms, and Dawn can probably go through all of this. Maybe I have my time frame wrong. But the Westlake landfill moms, the just moms, St. Louis, they got together and they basically forced the EPA to get involved and get engaged. So like even this next week, they're having a meeting with the EPA about the flooding and the breaches that they've had in this site. So they're kind of on these people. So what they did was they forced them to come up with a solution. So they capped the leak and put a pipe on it, and at least they're filtering it out because the neighborhood was smelling like rotten eggs all the time. And according to them, it smells a lot. And their children are all really sick. So that's the St. Louis area, folks. That's right out by the airport, if you were to actually look at what it was. And that's why all this stuff was put out there, because at the time that it was done, It was out in the middle of nowhere. So that's why they picked that. But, this is the sick part about the nuclear industry. They knew what they were doing when they put all of these sites right against the water. They know it causes harm. John Goffman did unequivocal studies during the 30s, 40s, 50s. He helped. He didn't invent, but he discovered uranium. He was one of the people that helped discover uranium-235. John Goffman was a pro-nuclear. He believed in nuclear weapons, but he did not believe in nuclear power. And his recommendation to the government was, yeah, this is a great technology, but we really need to study it because of this byproduct, this so-called waste. There's huge implications to life on our planet if we create too much of this stuff. I read this book of his called, I thought it was a joke, Population Control Through Nuclear Contamination. I think I told you about that. It's on my YouTube channel. It took me like 25 or 30 sessions of reading on YouTube, but I did it. And I think it really does matter that people can hear it or listen to it. It's a very hard book to find. It was kind of an oddity I found. I thought it was a joke, but it's by John Goffman and Arthur Tamplin. If you want to look for it, it's called Population Control Through Nuclear Contamination, and that book is shocking. In that book, he outlined how the Nuclear Regulatory the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, their low threshold model that they hold, acknowledges that for every ram or every sievert of radioactivity in the air, we have 32,000 cancers a year and just over 200,000 birth defects a year. This is why we have an epidemic. They also studied that low exposure to continued low-level radioactive contamination. These are all the symptoms that happen in St. Louis and at every nuclear site up at Hanford, at the National Laboratory at Diablo Canyon, around the area in San Onofre, anywhere there's nuclear contamination leaking, it's practically most sites, right? This is what you get. You get autoimmune diseases, you get autism, you get diabetes, and schizophrenia. And those things are kind of rampant in our society. Today someone asked, how come the Native Americans in Canada are all quite sick? It's because they insist on eating the salmon that's full of nuclear radioactivity. It's beyond comprehension. I know it's their cultural food, but they ought to stop. Because you can't take nuclear contamination out of salmon or tuna. After Fukushima, the government was testing this tuna. They stopped testing it because 100% of the tuna tested positive for cesium-137. In small amounts, but you know what? If you continue to eat it, it accumulates in your body. You ought not to be eating tuna. That is a for sure thing. Or salmon, to be frank. I haven't eaten it in probably 5 or 6 years. Every once in a while I'll eat a piece of fish. My niece, even outside of Astoria, I had someone say, oh, well, we caught this cod off of Astoria. Well, Astoria is right next to the Trojan nuclear power plant where they dumped the machinery into the river. The workers dumped the machinery into the river because they were mad about the plant being closed down. And it literally raised the temperature of the river next to the power plant by 2 degrees. You can go to the Department of Energy in Oregon and find this out. It is, when I started researching all this stuff, to be honest, it was like shocking. This is why I do this radio podcast. This is why I'm on the radio. This is why I'm willing to come on and just talk for an hour if I don't have somebody to interview. I want people to think about this and take it personally. Please take it personally because it is personally affecting you. It is harming your life and your children's lives and your grandchildren. Dr. Helen Caldicott basically said that nuclear contamination, the worst of it, doesn't even show up for 4 to 7 generations. That's why just now in Chernobyl, the children's birth defects is really off the charts. They're not getting away with this for nothing. You must take this personally. This is very serious information that has been downplayed. There's a guy that writes for Forbes. His name is James Conca. He's a pro-nuclear shill. And he writes every article about how nuclear is going to save our economy and save our future. He's the same kind of cat that tells us that, well, there's going to be other contaminants that'll kill you before nuclear. Well, that's probably true. But you know what? Not a lot of the other contaminants actually really destroy your state of life. But that's not true, because I did interview Erica Dugan, who is a fracking victim. But you know what? In fracking, you know what the secret ingredient is in fracking? Used nuclear fuel. They blow it up to blow it up down there. They have little mini depleted uranium bombs going off down there. So the contamination from fracking is from the heavy metals from the depleted uranium. And this is why I say we need to free science from corporate control, because they specifically do not test. Specifically, she can't even get a doctor. She lives, I think, in Kansas. No, not Kansas. It's a place that I don't think I could ever live. One of those southern states. Tennessee? It's not Tennessee. Forgive me. I don't remember. But her doctors won't even talk to her because she says she's a fracking victim. So her doctor basically said, you have to go out of state to find someone to help you. Can you imagine? Because she says she acknowledges that she's a fracking victim. This is a sad state of affairs that we find ourselves in. So I want people to take this personally. We hear about the Green New Deal and people getting active about the climate activists. But you know what? A lot of these climate change people and a lot of the people that say, oh, we're going to try to protect our waters. You know what they do? Like the NDR, National Resource Defense Fund. They worked with the state of Illinois to keep 2 leaking nuclear power plants open because their goal was to close down coal. It's kind of ironic because as soon as Trader Trump got in office, they rolled all those regulations back that they had just passed to shut down the coal industry in Illinois. So now we have these 2 nuclear leaking fuel plants and we have coal being produced in Illinois. It's incomprehensible. The short-sightedness of these so-called pro-environment people. They want nuclear energy because it suits their agenda. They could give a darn about what happens to the people who are exposed to it. It's incomprehensible. And then they get back on the fence. A big nuclear event happens. They're like, oh yeah, we're anti-nuclear. And they are for a little tiny bit, but then they're not really. Do you hear any of them talking about how Trader Trump is upending 80 years of nuclear safety regulations? In the drop of a hat, since last year, they started this last year, he hired a contractor that worked, I think it's called Assured Security. That's the nuclear facility that's going to take the low-level waste. It's actually high-level waste. And they gave $1.3 million to Rick Perry, who, by the way, only has a husbandry degree, a bachelor's of art in husbandry, which is animal science. We have incompetence running the Department of Energy. The Mr. Oops guy, oops, remember that? When he was asked, what are the 5 things? He couldn't even remember what the 5 agencies he was going to close down were. It's incomprehensible that Americans are listening to this. And frankly, it's incomprehensible. This show plays at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, no offense to KEPW, but I know people don't want to hear this, but this needs to be played loud and clear during the day when people are awake at 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, when people are awake and can pay attention to it and have time to call their elected officials. It's incomprehensible. We are in a clear and present danger from the Trump administration upending 80 years of nuclear safety. This is ringing the bell. I wish I had like a little ding-a-ling-a-ling. Maybe I'll add one in here. So I'm very excited about the interviews that I've lined up over the next few weeks. I hope they all come off as planned. Let's just put it this way. I did have an interview with Diane Turco that had to get canceled because of me, because I was in court with a client and I didn't get out in time, so I had to cancel it. And so now we've rescheduled it. So that will come in a couple of weeks. I want to thank everybody for listening to our show. You're talking to Lonnie Clark with the Age of Vision radio show. I guess you're not talking. I'm talking to you. And I kind of get all rabble-roused out. That's what June Chada told me today. She was like, they feel like they're fighting the good fight. And I feel like they are, being too complicit. I want them to stand up more. Jeff Merkley, Ron Wyden, Pete DeFazio, Kate Brown. They need to find their courage. They need to find their ethics and integrity. That's what I told June. I said, this is just not a matter of like political calculus. This is a matter of ethics, true ethics. Impeachment on the basis of what is right is ethical, not whether you're going to get the impeachment. I said to her, the Republicans, when they impeached Bill Clinton, didn't worry about whether the Democrats would pass the impeachment, which it didn't. He stayed in office, much like what would happen now. But what they're worried about is that, that the Republicans will win because the impeachment will make them look bad. No, you can't compare this, because Bill Clinton having sex with an adult intern, a young woman who was of age and old enough to know better, is 100% different than an impeachment hearing based on the fact that Donald Trump refuses to give oversight documents to the Oversight Committee about Jared Kushner's security clearance. Jared Kushner still has a security clearance, even though every single security agency said, this guy doesn't deserve it. He could be compromised. This is a danger to our national security. Trader Trump still gave him the security clearance. How did they come up with that decision? Jerry Nadler wants to know, and Donald Trump has given him the big fat finger. It's outrageous. That is an impeachable offense. We have children being tortured at the border. We could be showing pictures of what's really going on there. Right now, we have our congressmen and our senators who are being blocked from talking to what are literally prisoners. These are asylum seekers. These are people who are fleeing torture from Guatemala. All of the children that died were from Guatemala. These people coming here seeking asylum are from Guatemala. And you know why they're from Guatemala? Because prior to the Trump administration, our government was supporting their fledgling democracy. And the same year we had our elections, they elected democratically a president who was pretty so-called socialist, not neoliberal, who believed that, we need to take care of our people first. So the United States actually backed and funded basically a military dictator coup to overthrow that president, and they ousted him. And it has been a reign of terror since in Guatemala. This is why the Guatemalans are fleeing. They are coming here for safety. They're not stopping in Mexico because Mexico doesn't have the reputation of being a country where you can live safely and you can live in peace and where people accept you for who you are. That does not happen. They're coming to America because in America we have a constitution that grants us equality, or so they say. So this treatment of these people as prisoners is an outrage. They're not coming here illegally. They're not locking up people illegally. The raids, the so-called things that they're doing is beyond comprehension. In my view, these are impeachable offenses. It's an impeachable offense to torture children. And I venture to say that changing these regulations on the nuclear safety is a threat to our national security. I would say that that is an impeachable offense. It is beyond comprehension that people do not have an education in this country and do not understand that they are undermining our Constitution by saying, oh, well, it's okay if Donald Trump has a big, gigantic, like he needed to have that parade on the 4th of July so we could respect our army. No, our Constitution calls for not having a standing army. In my view, Bernie Sanders is 100% correct. The best way to economic recovery is through the 1% and defunding the industrial military complex, defunding the industrial pharma complex, the industrial medical complex, the industrial prison complex. That is what's running our nation and literally using us as assets on a balance sheet. They're making us sick intentionally. They're incarcerating us intentionally. They're oppressing the scientists and the thinkers in this country intentionally. This is how we slip into fascism. So yes, I want you to take this business about the nuclear contamination personally. So I want to thank my listeners. You've been listening to Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. And we are live on KEPW.org, www.kepw.org, or you can listen on the radio in Springfield and Eugene at 97.3 FM LP at 11 o'clock on Thursday nights. Or you can catch my podcast on Spreaker.com. Just look for the Age of Fission radio show. You could probably just Google the Age of Fission, but you might get my UCY things if you go to YouTube. So I suggest if you want to listen to my podcasts on my YouTube channel, that's Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART. And I also post them up to Twitter, which is Nuts for Art 2. So I want to thank you all, and I can't wait to share these interviews with people and start enlightening you to get you to understand this is not just our small little problem here with the Columbia Generating Station in Hanford just falling apart around our feet, which is a threat to the entire Northwest. This is a nationwide issue. Every little pocket of our nation has some terrible nuclear secret going on. That's what I've discovered since 2013 when I actively got engaged in this. Put your courage feet on, and that means, take action, do something. Take it personally. Figure out what you can do to engage in this and to stop the tide of destruction. And I believe that you will, and I am grateful that you're going to do something. And I look forward to talking to you guys next week and sharing our interviews with you in the next few months. And I hope to have a lot more interviews on a lot more regular basis. I want to thank all of our listeners on KEPW, on all my channels. Talk to you guys later. Put your courage feet on. And remember, happiness is resistance, and love is greater than fear. Thank you for joining the Age of Fission radio show. Please like, subscribe, and share on Spreaker.com or on the YouTube channel Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART. Send all comments and ideas to Lonnie Clark at ageoffission@gmail.com. We urge all, especially scientists and politicians, to follow the words of our beloved American icon, Mark Twain. Always do right. This will gratify some and astonish the rest.